Okay, so this is where we sort of finished the last time, where we had this multiple hypothesis testing, where rather than just matching one particle to one, or one particle in one image to one particle in the next image, where you actually explore all the possible routes or tracks that it could have taken and see which one is sort of most consistent over the entire time series that you're looking at, which is, of course, quite important when you're dealing with really long images that just looking between two frames doesn't give you enough information on what's actually going on. And then sort of the shortcomings, of course, of other of these approaches is once you have more complicated things like merging and splitting particles, that it requires a fairly good understanding of how likely these events are and how these work in order for you to do this multiple hypothesis testing well. So kind of as you make your models more complicated, things that would have been fairly simple to look at before become much more complicated. And so it's sort of a trade-off of how complicated of an analysis you use and how many of these things you want to explicitly take into account for your further analysis. So the next portion of things that we'll cover briefly, and we're in some of the exercises, is this idea of voxel-based approaches. And so what we did before was we started off with an image like this, and we just looked at all the objects. So you found the center of volume or center of mass of all of the objects, and you simply tried to trace what happened to that. With the voxel-based approach, you look at the images themselves, or some transformation of the images. So here you have sort of this original image at time 0, and this final image at time 1. And basically what you do is you use this correlation function. And so you look at sort of the average overlap, more or less, between these images for a given offset R. And the idea is that with an image like this, you then have a curve that comes out of this, or a 2D surface that comes out of this, that shows you sort of where this maximum point is, which corresponds to the offset between your first image and your second image. Yeah?
So this means you can use this just in case that there is an overlap. Like if the frame rate, let's say, is too low,
Yeah.
the particle moves like so far that there's no overlap, it doesn't work.
No, it still works. So what you do is you apply this offset R, and so you have to choose the range of R's such that it makes sense for your experiment. So if your pixels, for example, move 5 or 10 pixels between frames, then this won't show you anything because your maximum value will be right there, which means this window you need to choose for R needs to be larger. But basically what it does is what this is saying is kind of what R do you need to shift I1 by so that it's exactly the same as I0. So it assumes that the only transformation between I0 and I1 is a displacement. So of course, if your object stretches or grows or is twisting or other factors, then this won't work as well. But if it's just a simple displacement, then this factor works perfectly. And so what you come up with is this function, and there's a peak here. Do you have any idea why there's these other peaks that we see? I mean, in an ideal world, you'd expect there to be one peak.
It's like cyclic, so since you have a limited range, if it goes beyond certain lattices, it becomes back.
Right. So because it's periodic here,
Periodic.
yeah, if you shift a more than a certain amount, then you're back at the same position that you started at. And so with perfectly periodic systems, you'll have lots of sort of phantom peaks around. Because, and if you look at this image, it's not clear if it moved down by 2 pixels or if it moved up by 7. Because those would look exactly the same. And so without having more information, you can't actually say that that's the best answer. So here you'd have to either take acquisitions more quickly, and you would see sort of where does it show up in one frame or between these two frames to know did it move half as much or did it move actually this much greater. But typically the systems you're looking at are not so perfect, and there will be sort of unique aspects of the image so that you can actually say this particle moved to this point. And actually, with the voxel-based approaches, it's already better than the point-based approaches, because the voxel-based approaches sort of intrinsically take into account that these objects have different shapes. When you're just doing a point-to-point matching, all you're comparing are the center of volumes of the 2 points. You, at the very basic level, don't include any other information about that object. Here you sort of implicitly include the shape, the area, the volume, all of these factors, because you're looking at all the individual pixels rather than focusing on a single point. So now here you see, with sort of random image positions where you don't have a periodic structure anymore, that you can then apply that same sort of offset, and now you have one very clear peak or maxima that corresponds to the transformation that took place. And so we see that that only really happens with this periodic pattern when you have a perfectly periodic structure in the direction of the motion. So now if you kind of extend this, you can go beyond just having a displacement term r. You can actually include things like rotation and scaling. And so basically this matrix here is in 2 dimensions and accounts for the fact that you can have a scaling factor s, so your sample can become larger or smaller, as well as a theta rotation. And so it allows you to kind of take into account slightly more effects than if you just look at simply r. And when you look at sort of a standard microscope or experimental setup, it's usually not simply an r. There usually are some rotations taking place and scalings if your system isn't very stable or if your system's growing. So then here you have sort of 2 other factors that you have to kind of maximize, because you're not just maximizing the x and y of the r, you're maximizing the scale and the rotation as well. So you try to find then the peak in this 4-dimensional rather than 2-dimensional space. So then you can have even more complicated changes. So I think this one is just growing outward, so you can see, or shrinking. So you start off 0 here. This one moves a little bit closer to the center. This one moves closer to the center. This one moves closer. This one moves closer. This one moves closer. And so there's no clear offset of what's happening. And if you try to do the correlation on this, then you see sort of a peak centered at 0, which basically tells you that this R factor doesn't give you very much information, and that you need another sort of approach to try to map that better. And so with this one, you could try using the S, or you could try using some other system. I mean, I think in this, you'd probably have to center the coordinates first there in order to figure out what that transform is. But the correlation doesn't work well for something like this. But for a system like this, the nearest neighbor, looking at the objects, would work very well. So those objects are still identifiable as separate entities, and the closest one to this one is this one, and so you would get some sort of basic map that showed you how that worked. So one of the approaches you can use for dealing with problems like this is to kind of break the data set up a little bit. And so if you want to track how this sample is changing rather than doing the correlation over the entire image, you subdivide the image into small regions, and then you analyze each of these regions separately. And so this method is sort of called this digital volume correlation approach, and you look at each individual little block separately from the whole image. So here you show that image divided up into tiny little pieces, and then you can calculate that maximum for each one of these pieces to see how this piece changed. And so if you take this block size, then you can sort of get a bunch of displacement vectors that show you where the maximum is. And for this, clearly the block size in this case is matched fairly well, but for these ones is matched not always very well in terms of the displacement. So designing the size of your boxes so that you get a good result can be very tricky. And so if you have too large of a window, then you get a very coarse approximation of how your sample is actually changing. And so you just get sort of 3 arrows like this. These 2 arrows actually look correct, and this one's then way off. If you choose too small of a window, then you see the problem you have here is that you have regions where, I mean, this one it's quite clear what the overlap is, but with this one it's not at all. You can't really see what displacement would make the most sense for this region. These ones also don't. And so your window size has to be fairly well matched to the size of the structures you're looking at. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where you can't really come up with a coherent message on what's changing in your sample because the structures you're interested in you don't even see. This example is, of course, sort of especially easy because all of the samples have the same intensity. And normally, you would have intensity information here, which would give you a little bit more on sort of the structure and texture inside. But with only sort of the black and white image, you have no way of telling this pixel from this pixel from this pixel. You just have simply the outline of your object. So then if we go back to some of the test sort of experiments we did before, where you do something like shearing, and you try to see if you can track that shearing well, that for some parts of it, it works very well. For other parts of the image, it works very poorly. For compression, you end up with the same kind of problem. Here it's quite clear what happens. So all of the sample sort of portions get smaller. And when you try to track this, you sort of end up with this very messy result. And so with all of these tools, you need to be aware of how to interpret these results and how to be confident that your values are meaningful. One of the things that makes this approach more usable for general problems is when you start to incorporate physics into it. And so then rather than just having this correlation term you focus on, you sort of enhance this cost or loss function by adding some sort of deformation term. And so if you know that your materials are sort of elastic, then you know that sort of any deformation that's taking place is going to be causing sort of an internal stress or strain buildup in your system. And this is something that you want to avoid. And so when you're trying to minimize or optimize this function, you can include this deformation or number of deformation terms to account for that so that your results take into account some of these realistic situations. And so, this would be a deformation term. You can also have things like smoothness criteria that sort of if your velocity at one point is 1,000 meters a second, it's very unlikely that a second later your velocity is 0 or in the other direction. So you can force it to kind of maintain this smoothness. You can also sort of maximize or say what the maximum deformation or force is, so that rather than having sort of a linear term that goes with deformation, you can add something that the higher the force is, or that sort of has this cutoff, that as soon as you exceed this maximum force, there's a huge penalty added to this function. So one of the last things we'll try to cover quickly is just this idea of the distribution metrics. And so these metrics that we covered before, when you were looking at many different objects, I think I can open that slide quickly. So that when you have sort of an image like this, that you can actually do some assessment of the deformation and the changes that are taking place by looking at this distribution rather than looking at how individual things move. And so if you know your structure in the beginning is sort of like this grid or cube-like structure of points randomly distributed inside, and you at the end have a system with sort of these thin sheets, then you can be sort of estimate how much force or just deformation took place in order to transform a general structure like this to a general structure like that, without having to know exactly which points map from the input to the output, you can say that for a typical structure that looks like this is the force or the deformation that would need to take place in order to have this output. So this can be particularly useful when you're looking at systems where the deformation is so great or your imaging ability is damaging to the system, and so you don't really have a way of comparing the exact same sample in the beginning and the end. And that will then allow you to say, okay, this is what it looked like before, this is what it looked like after. You can then use models for analyzing what happened in between. And so this is pretty commonly used in sort of cellular systems like liquid foam. And so what you can do is you can kind of quantify deformation, so the strain factor, by looking at sort of the change in a unit of length over the length itself. This translates very well when you're looking at sort of a line that you deform. It doesn't work as well for voxels, and that's why we introduce these distribution metrics. So here you can sort of say, this is what your image looks like at the beginning. So you kind of have these square elements that have equal area at the beginning. And what we apply is sort of deformations to change all of these elements at the different points. And so here they get smaller in y, and here they get smaller in x. And so what we want to quantify is sort of this infinitesimal strain tensor on all of these elements. So basically what we can take is we can take the total strain and break it down into two different types of strain. The first is this volumetric, which is sort of how much the volume overall in all directions is increasing or decreasing. The second is this deviatoric. So this deviatoric is sort of like the anisotropy. So how much is it being shifted out of its original shape? And so if we go back to sort of this original image, that you have the volumetric strain, which sort of gets higher as you go up and to the right, and the deviatoric strain, which is actually 0 across this diagonal, because the deviation of the shape isn't changing. The anisotropy is the same before and after. And it gets higher just as you move along this axis or along the vertical axis. So yeah, so these things can be calculated and applied very easily to the distribution metrics that you get by looking at how the lengths of these links between the objects change between your sort of before and after samples. And I think there's an exercise that goes over that in a little more detail. So that I think we'll leave out for now because we want to move on to the next part. Were there questions over that part? Has anyone tried the exercises for the volume? No? Okay. Okay, so now we'll start on sort of the scaling up and big data portion. So again, this is the outline. Next week, there'll be a guest lecture on high content screening. And so ideally, it's still being finalized. It will be someone from Roche, who's now at the Personalized Medicine Center at ETH, who worked in high content screening for many years and to develop drugs for them and identify new potential targets. And so it'll go over kind of what they did. And then someone from ScopeM, which is the microscopy center at ETH, will talk about the high content screening they do for research experiments there. The week after will then be machine learning and deep learning. And so this will have someone from the Computer Science Institute here who works on deep learning projects with sort of convolutional and recurring neural networks. And then someone potentially who did their PhD on identifying streets and satellite images using some more complicated approaches. Because for that, you can't simply use segmentation and shape analysis. You need much more complicated metrics because the data sets have huge variations inside of them. And so he'll talk about what kind of approaches they use, visual bag of words and some of these other more advanced topics. And then finally, the week after that, you'll have the project presentations where you'll sort of do your presentations, 5 to 10 minutes, showing what tools you could use to analyze your image processing problem. So for this, there's a huge number of references available online. And so I'd recommend going through some of the presentations and videos to kind of get your own feeling for it, because this is just one short lecture on this topic and sort of will serve as a general introduction, but it certainly doesn't cover everything that's possible, and it doesn't cover any of the theory of how all of these different tools work together and how you can sort of build up all of this. For ETH students, what might be particularly relevant are sort of these Condor system, which is the clustering system set up within the Institute for Electrical Engineering. And so that allows you to use all of these computers in this room to parallel process jobs. And so you can use them as a cluster and do analysis on this. For ETH, for the people who, have any of you used Euler or Brutus? No. Okay. So those are the other clusters available. They're set up slightly differently, but they're the ETH-wide clusters that have thousands of cores and nodes that you can use more or less for free, but you have to wait in this queue in order to do your processing then. So Condor is probably quicker and easier because it's just for the Institute for Electrical Engineering, and so you can test things out there much simpler. Then sort of this idea of databases, which we go into very briefly, but there's of course much more presented and prepared in this, that you can look at other papers to understand how this applies to imaging data. And then kind of cloud computing. And so there's some things that you can look up in more detail if you're interested. Yeah. So for the outline, that basically the idea is we'll cover some of the basics from kind of computer science, the ideas that are important for understanding scaling up and big data. So how that's different from sort of the standard processing you've done before, and some of the sort of big concepts that are important to think about, particularly when you start designing new projects or new analysis approaches. We'll then talk about sort of normal data. And so that's kind of this idea of databases, which have been around for ages, and it's how most people work with large amounts of data today. And then sort of this jump to big data and what's different about it and how it works. Then we'll have some examples with some different tools, and then talk about cloud computing and beyond. So kind of the motivation for what's relevant for us for this is kind of the first thing is the really big data sets, because with this sort of analysis, you don't have any other choice. And so, you know, to get a computer with 256 gigabytes of memory is quite difficult. And it's very easy to generate data sets now in experimental situations that are terabytes or tens of terabytes in size. And so that means you have no ability to even open the data set in memory on a standard computer. And so if you're trying to analyze or do something meaningful with this data, you can't use a standard machine at all. You need a completely different approach, which sort of forces you to go into big data or some of these other areas. You then have the problem that with these larger data sets, so even with 20, 30 gigabyte data sets, that to read them in off the hard drive on one machine can become a major limiting factor because you're waiting for this machine to load the data, and it's quite time consuming. You then have the problem, which I ran into quite a bit during my thesis, that if one of the machines crashes, if someone logs into it, if it runs out of memory, if the hard disk fills up, then you lose everything you've done from the beginning. And so if you're dealing with 5 samples and you lose everything, it's not really a major problem. But if you're dealing with thousands of sort of images or patient records or anything, then you don't want to have to start from the beginning, and you don't want to have to manually check to make sure each task was completed correctly. And that's kind of where you get into this very messy business of writing checkpointing code. And so for any of you that have done cluster computing before, this is sort of the code that you write that saves intermediate states and then tries to resume if your program's interrupted. And this can be very difficult to implement, very difficult to do correctly, And of course, if it doesn't save the file correctly or it saves some additional information that shouldn't be part of it, then all of your results are meaningless. The next sort of reason to switch to this is the many data sets. And so for genome scale studies, you need thousands or ideally tens of thousands of samples, and you want them all to be analyzed identically. And so how can you easily parallelize this and distribute the computation to a number of different machines? Dynamic measurements can be the same way. And so some of these like foam experiments that we showed in the last lecture can have thousands of measurements, and each one of these measurements is then 20 gigabytes large, and so this is a huge amount of data to process and analyze. And so in radiology, you can get a petabyte of scans a year, and none of these scans are very big. But analyzing a petabyte is a huge amount of information to process. Finally, this aspect, which for scientists I think is particularly important, is this exploratory studies. And so if you're dealing with a 30 gigabyte image on one machine, and you want to test to see if one kind of filter works really well, then you run the filter and you wait for 6 hours for it to finish running, and then you can look at your image. And so your feedback loop is very, very slow, and it's unlikely that you'll be testing a lot of different parameters for this filter or looking at a lot of different options if it takes you 6 hours to get feedback. And if you can get that feedback instead in 30 seconds, you're much more likely to play around and explore with different parameters and see sort of what interesting things you can find out about your data sets. And so this we've seen very frequently in people that look at sort of single slices, are willing to play with all sorts of different features because you get a result quickly, and people that deal with very large data sets tend to just do one or two different things. Boom. So kind of example projects that are sort of at this scale is, so one of them is full animal phenotyping. And so this is taking a adult zebrafish and analyzing the entire sample. So if you play it again, this is then sort of sliced through images of this entire animal, and this is an adult, and so it's full size. It's not sort of a baby or an embryo. And so basically the data this produces is sort of 0.75 micrometer resolution, and you have 11,000 by 3,000 by 600. And so it's 20 to 40 gigavoxels of data that you're producing for the sample. And so what you want to be able to do is sort of look for single cells, look at the cell networks and connectivity, classify cells into different types. So is it a fat cell? Is it an eye cell? Is it a stomach cell? All of these other things. And then be able to kind of easily register it with histology. And so all of these tasks are tasks that for a data set this large are incredibly time consuming. And so if you can't deal with the data in a smarter way, you'll be overwhelmed by the amount of processing you have to do. The next project, which doesn't have as nice of a visual, is sort of this human brain project. So one of the sub-projects from the Human Brain Project at EPFL is looking at the full mouse brain. And so this involves about 1 cubic centimeter scanned at 1 micron resolution. And so this is then 1,000 gigavoxels per sample. Typically, you're only looking at one brain that you want to understand completely rather than a lot of different brains. But this then involves kind of registering all of the different subscans you do together, looking for blood vessels and structures and networks, which involves connecting the blood vessels you find in individual scans to each other, and then registering it with sort of other imaging modalities so that you can understand how this sort of network works together and what aspects are important. So what are these blood vessels actually supplying, and are there things that are sort of can be learned from this network? You know, do the blood vessels come first and then the neurons, or do the neurons come first and then they cause more blood vessels to form, and sort of questions like that that you want to be able to test. But with 1,000 gigavoxels, you can't even open the data set on a normal machine. You need something to process that scale. And sort of the questions that, the first question is kind of what's wrong with the usual approach. And so if you look for people who've done MATLAB or Python, this code will look more or less the same or very familiar. You take your image, you want to read it in, and then you perform sort of a median filter, you label all of the components, and then you count the different objects that you have, and you write the output to a text file. So this might be a perfectly standard approach, and it works very well for one sample, but it's very inflexible, and it doesn't give you the ability to sort of play around with your parameters easily or understand what's really going on. And so the problem is, if you want to sort of compare Gaussian and median, then you have to go into this and change this to a Gaussian filter. You then have to make sure that it saves it in a new place so it doesn't overwrite your old results. You then have to kind of tweak the parameters to make sure that the parameters still make sense, because maybe Gaussian wants a new kind of parameter. If you want to do this with 3D images instead of 2D images, you have to then rewrite this so that it handles the 3D images well. And if you want to run the same analysis for a folder of images, you then have to list all the files in the folder, change the script so that it reads in the file you give it, make sure it saves the output to the right file in the output, and you kind of have this whole coordination task of managing that. And for a small number of samples, it's okay. But as you start to look for more and more samples, this can be very, very tedious, and it can make it very tricky to know exactly what you did with all of the images that you analyzed. And so basically the major problem is you have to rewrite everything every time. And if you kind of start with this approach, it's very difficult to fix it. That typically your script won't look like this. Your script will have hundreds of lines, and you'll have to remember to make these changes in all of the different places where they come up, and sort of scaling it over beyond one computer and scaling it beyond several samples will be a major problem. And trying to reproduce results that you got before will be next to impossible. And so kind of the principles that we'll cover briefly with this are so the ideas of parallelism, distributed computing, resource contention, race conditions, deadlock, imperative, declarative. And the hope for this aren't really to make you understand all of these ideas, but to make you appreciate how difficult it is to solve these problems well. So many students kind of see this problem that they have here, and so they think that they can go solve this themselves by writing some parallel code or writing some distributed code to do this. And you end up sort of overlooking all of these potential problems and getting results that are either incorrect or unusable, because you sort of ignored many of these issues that come up that aren't sort of visible at the surface. So for parallelism, of course, you're probably familiar with these ideas already, that sort of if you have to walk for 5 minutes and talk on the phone for 5 minutes, that if you did them serially, so if you wrote a script that said walk 5 minutes and then talk 5 minutes, it would take you 10 minutes. But you can actually perform these tasks at the same time. So you can walk and talk on the phone because you have a hand which you don't need for walking and feet which you don't need for talking. And so they're kind of independent resources, and it's very easy to parallelize that problem. In the same way with your computer, most computers today, even most cell phones, have multiple cores inside of them. And so you can have cores doing different tasks at the same time. And it runs much faster because they don't have to wait necessarily for the tasks to finish. Distributed computing is then one step beyond this. And so rather than focusing on different cores within one machine, you focus on different machines. And so kind of the metaphor for this is that instead of having sort of you be able to walk and talk at the same time, you and a friend are able to do two different tasks at the same time. So you walk while your friend talks on the phone, and that sort of accomplishes both of these tasks. Or if your tasks were to jump rope for 5 minutes and to walk for 5 minutes, you can't do that really at the same time. I mean, I guess some people can, but fundamentally it's not a task that's easy to do. And so one person can walk for 5 minutes while the other person jumps rope for 5 minutes. Of course, the issues you have with distributed computing is that it's no longer entirely internal. And so what this means is that you now have the responsibility or the task of telling the other person what they need to do and making sure that they do it and making sure that they understood you correctly, Because if it's really loud outside and you tell them to jump rope, maybe they don't hear you correctly or they misunderstand you. And sort of, if they don't have a jump rope and you tell them to jump rope for 5 minutes and they just stand there and do nothing, then you have to go back and make sure that they actually do this. And so these are the sort of issues that come up with distributed computing, which don't happen as often with parallel computing, because when you're inside the same machine, you kind of clear all the resources that are present and the communication between them. Once you take this outside, you have a lot of new problems that come up with sort of delay and synchronization that are much more complicated because you have different machines that are interacting together and you're not all instantly inside the same machine. So to think about sort of distributed computing examples,
Excuse me.
yeah.
Can you please, I mean, this might be a very basic question, but differences between a CPU, a process, and machine. Okay? So it says you may no longer be on the same CPU process as you are on the same machine.
Yeah.
So machine would be like, this is one machine, this is the other machine.
Yeah.
And CPU would be cores.
Yeah, would be within like the same core. So if you're in the same core, for example, you can share memory. So you have the same cache, you have access to the same resources, and so you can pass things back and forth instantaneously between two processes or two things that are running inside the same CPU. Once you're outside the CPU, there's more of a delay, and once you're on another machine, this sort of delay is even longer.
So a CPU can have multiple cores.
Yeah.
And a machine can have multiple CPUs.
Yeah. And the delay between cores is very small. The delay between CPUs is longer, but still very small compared to the delay between computers. So that's where that sort of time factor comes in.
And here, when you mention process, it means cores.
A process, I mean actually like when you look at an operating system perspective, that you have different processes or different threads running, and these threads then run independently of each other. So you'll notice, if you do parallel processing, you can start 5 threads to do a task, and each one of them sort of does a different thing. And one of those threads can crash without having the rest of the threads crash. So if one of them tries to use too much memory or use memory it doesn't have permission to use, it will crash. But the rest of your processes will keep running, and if you don't actually check to see if this process crashed, you could end up using information that's corrupted or isn't completely finished because you didn't explicitly check to make sure this process finished successfully. And when you're all inside the same process, then kind of everything crashes at once and you don't have a problem that one tiny part of your program crashed without telling everything else. And so you'll see, particularly with tools like MPI, so this message passing interface, and Java, you'll have threads crash inside of your process. And if you don't handle this event well, then you'll have sort of corrupted memory states, which won't cause your whole program necessarily to crash, but it will cause the result you get out to be incorrect. So for example, if you are writing a program to count the total number of files on your computer. So you have a variable that's shared between all of your different processes called file count. Then you start a bunch of different threads for each folder on your computer to open that folder and count the number of files inside, and then add that number to this total file count, right? If one of these threads crashes, that folder won't be counted, but your program will still finish correctly and say this is the number of files on your computer, but that answer will be wrong. And so that's where you have to be sort of taking into account that when you start making threads and having processes run independently, that you won't always crash everything. You can crash parts of it, which is almost worse. Because if everything crashes, then you know there's no result. There's nothing to misinterpret. But if you get a number out that seems kind of correct, you could be missing several folders because those threads crashed and you have no idea.
You don't get feedback when threads crash.
If you handle it well, you do. But many people don't handle it well. Many people just start a bunch of threads and then wait for a while, or wait until the last thread that they started finishes, and then take the answer and go. And so you have to make sure that those tasks are handled well. And it's easy to make mistakes with how those are being done. And of course, that's just a very simple example. When you're dealing with images, you have images that are being passed and forth. You have multiple threads that are working on the same slice at the same time that are trying to sort of introduce different aspects. And so this coordination task becomes much more problematic. So to kind of have some more examples that show you the different levels of complication that you run into with these tasks, if you sort of have 10 friends who collectively know all of the capital cities of the world, and you want to know the capital city of a single country, you can just yell that country name out and wait for someone to respond. And so if you have your data sort of organized like this, you can have many different computers with many different data sets, and you sort of just announce a query and you wait for one of the machines to respond that that query is relevant for. For all the friends who don't know the capital, they just say nothing. And so that's kind of one fairly simple way to parallelize a complicated task, so to distribute a lot of data across many different machines. If you then have the problem of finding out who knows the most capital cities in the world, this is a slightly more complicated task because you can't simply have everyone yell out the number at the same time because you won't be able to hear it. You have to sort of have people take turn telling you how many capitals they know, and then you decide, you sort of keep track of which one's the highest. If each friend sort of has money with them, and you want to find the total amount of money, then you can sort of tell each person to yell out how much money they have in order, and then you add them all together. But you still have to go through your friends one at a time, and so that's not a very easily parallelizable problem. Does anyone have any idea how you could do that task faster? Yeah?
Each friend sums, like he takes the number from the last friend and adds his own number, then supplies it through the system, and the last one then tells the sum of all the friends.
But let's say the task of telling how much money you have takes a minute. How long will it take in your case? If you have 10 people? Yeah. And in my case, it takes 10 minutes as well, right?
You have them divide into groups and do it.
Yeah. How much faster is that?
Depending on how many groups you divide. You divide it in, then it's the amount of time to the overhead of creating the groups and the overhead of counting up the groups at the end. So,
But if it takes a minute to tell,
right.
and it takes you seconds to organize groups,
Okay, then it's insignificant. So
Yeah.
that's important.
so what you can do there is you can start to make sort of these trees where you have people pair up, and then each person tells how much money they have to their partner. Whoever has more money then has to find another person. The person who has less money is sort of out of the game. And so this you can then solve in a substantially faster time because all of the resources are able to act kind of independently. The point of kind of that task is really to see that to solve a problem for a group of people is much more about solving the problem of managing groups than it is about solving the specific problem. I mean, the solution you get for a parallel addition problem is very different than the solution you get for a standard addition problem.
So that's pretty interesting because what I would suggest you would take it to a hierarchical or a high-level organization, whereas what you're saying is sort of independent. So that would save you more overhead.
Yeah.
So I guess you have something similar in terms of software.
Yeah. So with this,
module can do it in order to self-organize between the others.
right. I mean, ideally, you want to have a situation where you have a very simple organization because you don't want to have to go to each person and explain to them exactly what they need to do. Because if you do this for 10 people, it works. But then if you have an 11th person, what does this 11th person do? And you have to come up with kind of a whole new system for what each person has to do in order to do that efficiently. And so that's one of like the major differences between like high performance computing, where you have 10 people and you tell each person exactly what task they have to do, and sort of distributed computing, where you also have 10 people, but you don't tell each person exactly what to do. You come up with sort of what tasks need to be done, and that gets done in that way. So now, if we change this to sort of a problem that's a pretty standard Google interview problem, if you have 1 million numbers on 1,000 different machines, so each machine has 1 million numbers on it, how do you find the median of all of these numbers? So how would you do it if it was all on one machine?
So,
Yeah. And then you just take the one in the middle or the two in the middle and average them. But now if they're all on different machines, what do you do?
Take the one in the middle in every machine.
And then the one in the middle of that? So that's could work and would probably give you a reasonable answer for most situations, but it would not give you the right answer, because you could have, if each one of the machines had, or if one of the machines just had one number on it, that was 1 million, and the other machines all had a number on it that was sort of smaller or much larger, it's very easy to create a situation where the median of the medians isn't the median of the whole set. So if you have things called skew in your distribution. The easiest solution would be then to copy all of the numbers onto one computer and have the computer go through that. But if it's millions of numbers or billions of numbers, which is what Google has for sort of their search machine, then it's a very challenging problem. So I won't tell you the answer because I think it's much more interesting to think about it for a while and to try to think what kind of algorithm could solve that problem. But basically, the challenge of finding the median on many different machines is a completely different problem than finding the median on one machine. And so to solve these problems in large systems efficiently is sort of a science unto itself. And it's completely different from the task of solving individual problems on individual machines. Cool. Okay, so I think we can take a break there, unless there's any questions about that stuff up until now.